So, I'd like to start with a poem. You like that, huh? Snuck that in on you.
We can start with the story.
And this is a...
Goes to the boys.
Exactly. This is a poem that I found through Robert Bly that speaks to the nature of engaging with story. At least that's how I look at it. It's titled Warning to the Reader. Sometimes farm granaries become especially beautiful when all the oats and wheat are gone and wind has swept the rough floor clean. Standing inside, we see around us, coming in through the cracks between the shrunken wallboards, bands, or strips of sunlight. So in a poem about imprisonment, one sees a little bit of light. But how many birds have died trapped in these granaries? The bird, seeing freedom in the light, flutters up the walls and falls back again and again. The way out is where the rats enter and leave. But the rat's hole is low to the floor. Writers, be careful then by showing the sunlight on the walls, not to promise the anxious and panicky blackbirds a way out. I say to the reader, beware. Readers who love poems of light may sit hunched in the corner with nothing in their gizzards for 4 days, light failing, the eyes glazed. They may end as a mound of feathers and a skull on the open boardwood floor.
Yeah. I'm not listening to the rest of this story. So does anyone here remember? Does anyone here remember how the people of 2 wigwams, the Menominee people, they lived in a forest? Do you remember how things were pretty good? But do you remember that there was a witch that lured children away from that village and those children never came back? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Do you remember how the old woman in the woods rolled the ball out toward the people of 2 wigwams and how a young boy saw that ball and he had to have it? Do you remember that?
Yes.
Do you remember how he followed that ball and it rolled back just out of his reach and it led him back to the lodge of the old woman? Do you remember that?
Yes.
Do you remember how the boy fasted and fasted again and how he turned his face to the wall and fasted further until the Manidoos came to him and they shared their power with that boy? Do you remember that? Do you remember how that boy made weapons, a spear and a war club and a bow and some arrows, and how the Manidoos had given him other powers, powers of perception, powers to change his shape? Do you remember that? Do you remember how the old woman sent him out and told him that there was a bad one who lived in the world across that river, that great rapids, that he would find the bad one, and he was sent out to find the gold and the wonderful little bridge that the bad one had kept with him? Do you remember that? Do you remember how he came to that river, that terrible rapids, so powerful that when he threw a stick into it, the stick disappeared instantly? Do you remember that?
And you remember those tentative steps, those frightened steps across that river with the ball tied to his foot? And you remember him spying
Down on the
village, the huts of the evil one, of the bad one? Yeah. And you remember how he caused the bad one to be hungry, so hungry that he left the hut, left his treasures? And you remember how he snuck down inside and stole those treasures, stuck the gold under the left arm, and stuck the wonderful bridge that would extend across any chasm, any distance, any river, and he stuck that under his right arm? Do you remember that? How he hid himself there?
Yes.
Do you remember hiding in the robes? And you remember how the bad one, when he found out that the gold was falling from the rafters, raced back in searching for the thief? And you remember how he was discovered, and how when he was discovered, he stood up and told them honestly that he was the thief, that he was the one that stole the gold in the bridge, and how the lung woman took the knife and slid that blade down his armpit, taking the gold, and slid her blade down the other armpit, taking the bridge. Do you remember that? And do you remember how he took on the fat so that he could be cooked? And the bad one would go get the water monsters, and they would come and have a feast on his body. Do you remember that?
And you remember how he caused the lung woman to take a sip of that fine broth, and how he tricked her to coming close so that he could tip that boiling hot, scalding water onto her and kill her? And you remember how he went into the hut, took that gold back, put the gold bag under one arm, and took the bridge and put it under his right arm? And you remember how he burned that hut to the ground so that there was nothing left? And you remember how he crossed over the river and sat there waiting, and how the bad one came back, not finding his hut, water monsters in tow, looking for a feast, and realizing that he was undone? Do you remember that? And now, do you remember the agreement? Do you remember that? The bad one saying, "I will come and serve you if you will only take me with you and bring me across the river." Do you remember that? And you remember how the ball carrier extended that bridge across the river and coaxed the bad one over. And when he reached the middle, he pulled the bridge back and dropped the bad one into the river, where he disappeared. Do you remember that? And finally, do you remember how, forgetting to ask the Manados, forgetting to ask those spirit beings how to return home, he wandered the land until he found a place where he was so tired, he laid his head down next to a tree and fell asleep, falling into the sleep of the dead? It's story time. In the dream time, the ball carrier dreamed the deep dreams of the dead, and he slept there for a long, long time. So many days that the seasons changed, and in the springtime, there came to the area where the ball carrier lay an old man who began stamping a circle around the area where ball carrier lay to sleep. And this old man was creating a space where he could put in a garden, where he could grow the deep root vegetables and feed himself. And in doing so, he spied there next to the tree the sleeping ball carrier. And taking a moment and taking in this vision, the old man walked back towards a stand of poplar trees, and taking a part of a trunk of a poplar tree, he took out his knife and he began whittling. And he curled off beautiful white shavings until he had in his arms the shape of a beautiful woman. And when that shape was complete, he breathed life into the woman, and he brought her forth living. And he said to her, "Go to that place by that tree, and there you will find a young man sleeping. Take him to my hut over in the distance there. Take him in and feed him and nourish him and waken him, and he will become your husband." And so this beautiful woman walked over to the tree and reached her arms underneath the ball carrier and picked him up and lifted him and carried him over to the hut. Went inside, laid him down in the blankets, went and prepared food and water, and came back and with great tenderness fed him, gave him food, gave him water. And when he woke, they became husband and wife. And they lived like this. They lived well for a time. You know what this is like? We remember having this kind of a relationship, this tenderness. But inside the ball carrier, something began to stir. And one morning, he rose, looked into his wife's eyes, and said, "I'm a wandering man, I'm a traveler, and it is my destiny and my duty to go into the world and discover those beings that would harm the people and kill them, and so I must take my leave." And with that, he took up his bow, his club, his arrows, and his spear, and he turned and he walked away. And as he did so, that beautiful woman's skin grew hard. The light in her eyes receded, and she returned to the shape and form of the log from whence she came, and she lay down and was at her end.
So Ball Carrier walked for a long time or a short time. And one day, toward evening, he came upon a lodge. And as he approached the lodge, he saw that coming from the door there was light, and that there was a woman inside that lodge preparing food. And as he came up to the lodge, the woman, without turning around, said, "Welcome, Ball Carrier. I've been expecting you. And it's a good thing that you showed up tonight. I have a sister. My sister's a nasty piece of work. She's a witch. She'll want to kill you. She'll ask you to put her head in her lap so that she can pick the vermin out of your hair. Be careful. Watch her closely. She is not to be trusted." And then Ball Carrier sat down and he had something to eat with that woman. And they became husband and wife. And after a time, a woman came, the woman's sister, the witch. Ball Carrier didn't like the look of her. For one thing, the woman had red hair. I don't mean Irish girl red. I mean fire engine red hair. And she also had a very short skirt. The woman said, well, brother-in-law, so good to see you. What fun we'll have. Why don't you lay your head in my lap? I'll pick the vermin from your hair." And Ball Carrier said, "Well, sister-in-law, if we're to play any games or have any fun, you're going to have to put on a longer dress." Well, the sister went back to wherever it was she lived, and the next morning Ball Carrier got up very early, and he went out looking for the lodge of the red-haired witch. And he came upon a lodge, and outside it he saw two scraggly children. They were eating something, and when he looked closer, he noticed that they were chewing the flesh off human bones. And he knew that the witch and her children there were cannibals. And after a time, the children scampered off somewhere. And Ball Carrier heard all the animals and birds, and they were warning him. They were saying, "Ball Carrier, get out of here. This witch is bad news." But he said to them, "Listen, animals, don't give away my position to the witch. If you keep my secret, if you keep me hidden, I'll give you lots of good food. I'll prepare a feast for you." And all the animals agreed to this bargain, except one. Chipmunk was off doing something. He didn't hear the deal. After a time, the witch came back. She had a couple of little children in her belt that she'd killed for the morning's meal. And she began to tend the fire and prepare to clean and cook these children. And Chipmunk piped up, "Hey, there's a man over here. Hey." And Ball Carrier said, "Chipmunk, what are you doing? Listen, I will give you lots of good food. Just keep quiet." And the witch, without turning around, said, "Chipmunk, what are you going on about? Did I not tell you not to make any noise unless that man was here?" And Chipmunk said, "Oh, I was just talking to Blue Jay. Stole my acorn. It's nothing." And Ball Carrier was laying there thinking about how he might kill this witch when the black-headed woodpecker came to him and said, "Ball Carrier, I know a way to kill this witch, and I'll help you. You see, her heart is not in the normal place. It's under that red scalp of hers. And I'll help you kill her if you promise to give me that red scalp." And Ball Carrier agreed, and as soon as he did, that woodpecker took off like an arrow, and with his sharp beak, he shot right through that red scalp and pierced the heart of that witch, striking a death blow. And she cried out, and she started crawling around on all fours, and with her knife, she was lashing out this way and that, trying to take something with her as she went. And Ball Carrier jumped up, and he took his war club, and after many blows, he beat out her brains, and the witch lay dead. And then, good to his word, he took out his knife, and he took that red scalp, and he took the finest top piece of it, and he presented it to the black-headed woodpecker, who put it on his own head, and he wears it there to this day. And Ball Carrier went into the witch's hut looking for those children, those cannibal children, because he knew if he didn't get them, killing the witch was no good. But they weren't there. And Ball Carrier looked around, and he used the powers of perception that the Manidoos had given him, and he saw that they were hidden in a cave in a mountain. And he took his war club, and he began to beat the earth, beat the earth, beat the earth until that mountain opened, and those children were revealed. And he took his club, and he clubbed those children. And then he went back to his wife, and he lived with her for a time. He lived in that place, and he hunted, and he provided for her. But one day he said, "Wife, you know how it is with me. I'm a traveling man. My destiny is to go out into the world to kill the bad things that would harm the people." And so he turned away from that woman, and he walked out into the world.
Carrier took those steps down the path, and he walked for a long time. He traveled the dark ways, the narrow paths, side, this way, that way, until finally one day he came to a crossroads, a place where the forest crossed the path. And as he neared that forest, he could hear in the distance the crying of a woman, crying for help, screaming for help. And so when he came up to the forest, he'd made the left turn, trying to search for that crying voice. And he traveled for a while until he came to a place where there was a great cliff. And this great cliff had above it high, he could see a window through. And below that window was a great door, and it appeared to be the abode of a giant. And he could still hear the woman crying, but the voice was now behind him from whence he came. So he turned and he wandered back, looking for this voice, until in the distance he spied a beautiful woman. And this woman was crying for help. And as he neared, she came up to him and she said, "There is a giant who has attacked my village, and he has killed half of the people. And he is after me now." And Ball Carrier, seeing her, knew that he would like to help her. And so he gave her these instructions. He said, "Do this. Go back and you find that giant. And when you find him, you tell him that Ball Carrier is waiting for him. And when you bring him to me, and you see that the two of us are engaged in conversation, go and find your father and find his warriors and bring them here with their weapons so that they may kill the giant." And so the woman took off, and Ball Carrier went back to the cave, opened those great doors, went inside, closed them, and barred them tight. And he went upstairs to the window. And looking around in that room, he could see that there were many weapons, and he saw there a very, very sharp knife.
And as he waited, looking out the window, he could see in the distance the trees shaking back and forth, as though something great were working its way through the woods in his direction. And soon, out into the clearing below the cave, was this great beast. With a giant club, and in his belt were children that he had captured for his meal that evening. And as soon as that giant came into the clearing, he looked up and saw Ball Carrier looking at him through the window.
Hey!
And Giant said,
Why don't you come down here?
"Open the doors that we might have a meal together." And Ball Carrier, looking down, said, "How about this? Why don't you reach your hand up here and I will pull you in, because it's simply too far down there for me to go and open the door." Meanwhile, the young woman, she took off at a great speed, a scamper, and raced out of that clearing, going back to where her father was to give him the instructions that she was given. And the giant, reaching up, seeing a potential meal, took his hand and reached up, and Ball Carrier took his hand and reached down and took hold of the giant's hand and began pulling him up into the window. And as he did, the giant stuck one arm through, one shoulder, and as his head went into the window, Ball Carrier grabbed his hair, took that long knife, reached behind back of the neck, and slid that knife right through, cutting that head clean off. And as he did so, that head bounded into the room and began snapping back and forth, trying to get hold of Ball Carrier and bite him and chew on him. And Ball Carrier took up his great war club and began chasing that head around, bashing it, hitting it, striking it, until finally the giant's head stopped moving. And the giant's body? Well, it slid back out the window into the clearing, landing with a great splat, and it leapt up headless, taking up its great war club and started bashing around, flailing this way and that, trying to find anything to kill. And just as this was happening, the young woman's father, the chief of the nearby village, arrived with his men, and seeing this hideous sight, this headless monster that had been devouring their people, he began firing arrows, spears. The men danced around with their clubs until finally the giant's body lay dead. And Ball Carrier, looking out the window, seeing this, took that dead giant's head, wrestled it up to the window, pushing it out, splat, down into the courtyard. And coming down and opening the doors, Ball Carrier presented himself to the chief, and he told the chief, "Get your woodcutters. Gather much firewood. Let's build a great pyre here." And as Ball Carrier looked around, he could see the bones of human beings all around his clearing. Some old, some very old, almost dust, and some very new. And so the woodcutters went and gathered much firewood, and they built a great pile, and upon which they put the giant's body and his head. And they set that pile to fire, and they burned and burned, white hot heat for 3 days and 3 nights, and at the end of the 3 days and 3 nights, that giant was burned down to a fine white ash. And Ball Carrier knelt down, and taking a great breath, blew into that ash, and as the particles lifted up into the sky, they turned into birds and began circling around. And Ball Carrier took his wonderful, wonderful bow and arrows, and knocked an arrow, and reached into the sky, pointing high, drew, the long pole and let that arrow fly. And as he did, he cried out, "People, people, arise! The sky is falling! People, arise!" And as he did so, those bones that had been most recently killed took on flesh and sat up and were amazed to see that they were now in the circle. And Ball Carrier reached in and took another arrow, knocked it, pulled it back all the way and released it and cried again, "People, people, arise, arise, the sky is falling, arise." And those bones that had been dead for a while, they too took on flesh and arose and joined the rest of the people. 6 times he did this until the oldest of the bones had taken on flesh and come back to life. And a great feast was called. And during this feast, the chief came to Ball Carrier and said to him, "Ball Carrier, it is obvious that you are a very powerful man. I would like to give you my daughter in marriage and the honor of becoming the leader of this tribe." And so that day, Ball Carrier was wed to the chief's daughter. And he took on the role of being the chief of that village. And he ruled well for a time. He ruled well for a time. Until one morning that thing in his breast began to awaken him. And he knew. And he went to his wife and he said, "You must know that I'm a wandering man, that I'm a traveler. And I am destined, and it is my duty to go into the world in search of those evil things that should be killed to protect the people. So I must take my leave of you now." And with that, Ball Carrier took up his spear, his club, his bow and arrows, and he left and wandered the land once again.
Ball Carrier walked for a long time or a short time. And one day, towards evening, he came to a lodge. And in that lodge, there was a fire burning. And next to that fire, there was a woman cooking food. Yeah. Surprise, isn't it?
Shocked.
I know.
Shocked.
Guess what she said?
Can't imagine.
She said, "Welcome, Ball Carrier. I've been expecting you." Which in itself is a strange thing when you're in a country you've never been in a lodge you've never been in, a woman you've never seen before, and she's expecting you. Well, keep a sharp eye out. She said, "It's a good thing you came this night, for my sister is a witch, and she wants to kill you." Ball Carrier sat down, and he had some food, and he married that woman. He never learns. And a while later, his sister-in-law showed up with her 2 little kids. And she said, "Well, brother-in-law, I've been waiting for you. I think we should have a contest. Play some games. See who's the most powerful here." And Ball Carrier said, "Well, before we do all that, tomorrow morning, let's you and I have a little foot race. We'll see who wins." And the witch said, "Oh, we can have a foot race. We can do that." And the next morning, Ball Carrier went out on the prairie and he said, "Sister-in-law, you see that spot way out on the prairie, the farthest thing you can see? Let's race to that spot and then back to here." And the witch said, "Brother-in-law, let's make it interesting. Whoever wins the race gets to kill the other one." Ball Carrier said, "It's a deal." And so they towed the starting line. And they agreed that when a particular chickadee that was sitting on a branch nearby left that branch, that the race would start. And the chickadee people are a busy lot, and that chickadee didn't sit long before his feet leapt off that branch and he burst into the air and they took off running. Now, Ball Carrier, you remember the Manidoos gave him the power to change his form. So Ball Carrier turned himself into a wolf, and he took the lead. But after a while, even a wolf gets tired. And that witch had some power too, and she caught up to him and passed him. So he turned himself into a pigeon, and he again took the lead, but after a while, the witch again caught up to him and took the lead back. So he turned himself into a crow, and again he passed the witch. But after a time, the witch took the lead again. So Ball Carrier was tired of messing around, so he turned himself into a Cooper's hawk. Now that is a fast bird. He went zipping by that witch. But again, the witch caught up and passed him. So he turned himself into a duck hawk. And again he took the lead, but again she caught up and passed him. So he turned himself into a sharp-shin hawk. And he took the lead, but again she caught up to him and passed him. And now they were at the turn and they were heading for home. So he turned himself into a sparrowhawk and he took the lead. But as they were coming up towards the finish line, again the witch caught up and passed him, and Ball Carrier realized that it was possible that he could lose this race. And just before the witch crossed the finish line, Ball Carrier transformed himself one more time. This time he transformed himself into Hummingbird. And just before that witch crossed the finish line, she heard a buzzing sound, a hum, zip by her right ear. It was Ball Carrier, and he crossed that line just ahead of her. And he transformed himself back into his human form. And the witch came up, protesting that there had been a violation, that the rules committee needed to review this race. No. But Ball Carrier just took his war club, and he struck her on the head and killed her, dropped her right there. Ball Carrier's wife came up to him and she said, "You know, unless you get my sister's children, this whole thing has been for naught." And Ball Carrier looked around and he saw that they were hiding in a cave in the earth, and he took his war club and he pounded on the earth. He pounded on the earth. He pounded on the earth until it opened, revealing those little cannibal children, and he smacked them with his war club until they were dead. And he lived with that wife for a time. And one day, though, he said, "You know how it is with me. You know how it is. My maletas, they're packed. I'm a traveler." And he left that woman, and he walked out into the wide world, and the story could end there, but it doesn't. But that's where we'll leave it for now.